Hey folks, Zach Osprey here, UN Center. Indianapolis Star. Is Tuesday, September 3rd, 2024. This is Mind Your Banners for September 3rd, 2024. Forgive the delay on this. The holiday got in our way. We were going to do this Sunday night, and then my 6-year-old declared it was movie night and invited half the neighborhood over to our house at about 7:30 on Sunday night. So that is firmly my responsibility for this taking a little bit longer. But he is Mike Niziolek from the Bloomington Times. Mike, I have this wonderful hockey book I found, The Making Whoopee. What do you think about that? I was just playing with it. This is great audio, but we're talking about Indiana 31, Florida International 7. We're not going to talk very much at all about the Western Illinois game. I just refuse to sort of treat it as a real concept.
Wait, can I read this? Northern Illinois had 706 yards of offense.
Northern Illinois. Okay, so this is right. For a second I thought you said Western Illinois, and I thought you meant like last season, like over like 11 games.
That actually might have been how much Western Illinois offense had last season.
Western Illinois lost in their opener 54-15 to Northern Illinois. They were down 34-3 at halftime. They were down 47-8 at the end of the third quarter. So, and that's Northern Illinois. So if you're Indiana, obviously, you very much need to win this game comfortably. I mean, Ethan Hampton, Northern Illinois' quarterback, was 18 of 20 for 328 yards and 5 touchdowns. This was the game. It's worth remembering that Indiana added in lieu of the Louisville series, which I think we've talked about before, was dropped because Indiana is essentially just trying to buy its way to 3-0 in the non-conference, and I think everybody understands why. And again, we're just going to leave it to one side because it's just not worth the analysis. Indiana 31, Florida International 7.
I'm reading Northern Illinois.
You're not going to let this go, are you?
Their quarterback had I don't know how quarterback efficiency ratings calculated. It was a record 310.3 quarterback efficiency rating.
You're just going to keep circling back like Jiminy Glick. You're going to be like,
yes.
Then.
It was the third most yards ever for NIU in program history. This has become an NIU podcast.
Well, I look forward to meeting the people who turned this on, and were thrilled to find that it became a Northern Illinois football podcast. But we are talking about Indiana versus Florida International. Hoosiers win. Curt Cignetti's debut as head coach. Mike, I think in a lot of ways just looked very week one. You know, it's hard to tell anymore what coaches are keeping vanilla, what they're experimenting with. Curt Cignetti told us not many freshmen would play, not many freshmen did. I think the biggest surprise was probably that the defense looked a little bit sharper than the offense. I think both because of some things that Curt Cignetti said, and then also just because, you know, frankly, you just felt the offense probably had more experience, more proven, more pieces. That the offense would be maybe more the talking point in this game. And it wasn't bad, but it wasn't without mistakes. 7 of the 9 penalties were on offense. They allowed a couple sacks. Curt Cignetti talked afterward about pass protection not being quite what he hoped it would be, whereas your defense allows under 200 total yards, 4 sacks, 8 tackles for loss, forced a turnover. Just I think Florida International may have crossed the 53 times all game. You know, just a much better game on that side of the ball.
You think it was much better on the defense?
No. I guess much. Well, what I would say is much better than maybe you would have expected. I didn't mean much better than the offense. I meant we thought the defense would be something of a work in progress, that we need to find some depth, whatever. It was the defense that looked just like kind of sharper and more polished on Saturday.
Well, yeah, and I think, you know, they stopped the run really well. You know, like you said, I was looking at the Pro Football Focus grades, and those aren't everything, but just in terms of how many pressures they logged, 18. That looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 guys with at least one quarterback pressure. You know, that looks a lot different than it did last year. Mikel Kamara led the team with 4 of those. So, like you said, you know, and they talked throughout fall camp about that's kind of their formula. that they lean on kind of stopping the run and being disruptive. And that's certainly, what allowed them to sort of shut FIU down. I don't think the secondary was tested all that much in terms of their quarterback being accurate or having a real good grasp of, the passing game.
Except when he was throwing to Rocky Beers. When he was throwing to Rocky Beers, that was
I mean, there was that one, like attempt on the sideline that was almost thrown in the stand. It wasn't like
yeah.
this was the best of offensive tests, but you play who's in front of you, and they did well.
I think that the big thing for me, two things. Number one, you talk about how many different players get involved, because I think we said throughout the off season that it felt like Indiana at least had a small collection of guys that you thought it could count on. Aiden Fisher, Jalen Walker, maybe CJ West. You mentioned Mikhail Kamara. A couple others, but to get. I mean, I think I'm looking at this right now. I think 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different players log at least half a tackle for loss in this game. If I'm counting right, the 4 sacks came from 4 different players. Just the extent to which we've talked about, Indiana's going to need depth, and some of that is depth of bodies, and that's more just like they got to keep players healthy. But some of it is depth of options and depth of just sort of almost like weapons or tools that the scheme can use to create different situations. To see, for it to feel like that many different players were sort of positively contributing to the overall whole, and that it wasn't just, Fisher Walker, Pons were your 3 leading tacklers. They were really good. Pons had a pass breakup, but that there were some other guys that were getting involved and kind of making a nuisance of themselves, I think was a positive for Indiana, because that is at very least depth in terms of impact. Maybe it's not depth in terms of bodies if guys start to get hurt, but it's at least depth in terms of not necessarily thinking you're going to have to rely on just a small clutch of players to kind of make all your plays for you.
Well, I'll put an asterisk next to that, because I think what you're talking about is the defensive line almost exclusively, because when the game was sort of competitive, they did
it
not.
Was like that. It was like that at James Madison though too, and I know that we can't.
No, but my point is that they were not rotating the back end. The starting linebackers, Aiden Fisher in particular, played the entire game. Pons and Jameer Johnson at corner played basically the entire game. So they're obviously they have a clear sort of packing order on the back end of the defense, but they are going to rotate that defensive front. I think some surprising things to me, CJ West obviously still maybe getting into game shape that they like, because he only played 19 snaps. Andrew Turvey, a walk-on, played 16 snaps so at a defensive end role, and it looks like he's kind of basically maybe the 5th defensive end.
Had a sack and I think a pressure too.
Yeah, he played more snaps than Jacob Magnum Farrar, so I thought that was sort of notable. So, like you said, that they are rotating the defensive front, pretty regularly. Kamara obviously led all those guys with 49 snaps, but the back end, just to me, they've got their guys, and unless injury sort of shakes things up, it looks like they're going to stick with those guys, and there were no surprises there. From what we saw in sort of throughout fall camp.
I didn't go back and listen to our podcast before from last week, where we just kind of created like a first 11 on both sides of the ball, but I feel like we weren't far off in the sense that I think we both thought West, would get there.
I mean, Burris started ahead of West.
I think I said I thought Farrell would play the Rover. You thought he'd play at the back end. He started at the Rover, but he was kind of all over the field, which is probably just how that position is going to be. I don't remember if we got the tackles right. I think we did or the guards, the offensive guards right. But I mean, in general, like it was pretty much what we expected. Like it wasn't on both sides of the ball. It was pretty familiar to what anybody who was kind of following offseason developments would have thought it would be.
Yeah, and they talked about sort of positional flexibility, at least from the what PFF logged. Asbury and Sanguinetti basically split their time between free safety in the box. It doesn't look like they have much delineation between like the strong safety and the free safety, playing farther back and playing like sort of in. So that's sort of maybe a change from last year a little bit too. And then Farrell obviously was sort of the slot guy. But you can kind of those are things we didn't kind of have a grasp on because we didn't get to see much obviously live action during practice.
I guess I mean, I don't know if there's a lot more to talk about defensively. I think it's encouraging when a guy like Farrell, that the staff clearly thinks, has a high ceiling young player, played some last year as a freshman. I think you always like a guy like that getting a play like that. I think in a game like this, that, it would mean something to any defensive back to get a pick. But if that's Josh Sanguinetti, if that's D'Angelo Pons, if that's somebody who's already got a certain level of status within the team, then you maybe feel like it just kind of is what it is. But when it's a young player that you really are pushing to sort of tap their potential, and you're saying, listen, go find your ceiling, go, this is how good we think you can be. Now you've got to go make it happen. Like, I think it's encouraging for there to be. I think it's encouraging to see a guy like that get a moment like that. And then, if you're Cignetti, I think there's also like one of the sort of, I guess, most consistent themes of his tenure so far, when he's talked about, when we've asked about competitions and different things, is he's just says like the best players will play, the best players will get the snaps, the players who earn it will get it. It sounds simplistic. I know people think that happens everywhere. It doesn't always necessarily happen everywhere. Hasn't always necessarily happened close to home in the past for Indiana. And I'm not speaking about any one incident specifically, but I also think it's probably good when you give a guy like Andrew Turvey some chances. You talk about the guys that he got more snaps than, guys that we thought were going to be more involved, certainly than a walk on, may still yet be more involved long term than a walk on, in terms of maybe when the games are bigger. And you also never know when maybe a guy is carrying an injury that's not serious. He can dress, he can warm up, he can play, but the staff is saying, we're not going to go crazy in terms of asking you to do too much in a game like this, because it's just not worth risking aggravating this, whatever. But I do think it's also good for Cignetti when one of the consistent messages has been like, I don't care who you are. If you earn it, I'll play you. And then a guy who probably epitomizes that as much as anybody else on this defense does get those snaps, and he makes the most of them. Again, I think he had a pressure. He definitely at least flushed the QB once, and then he sacked him a second time. So I think that's probably also something that, in terms of just like the individual, the small wins that any coach is going to want to take out of a game, those felt quietly important for me on defense.
Well, and you talk about kind of, this team doesn't have a ton of returners, especially on defense and key roles. And Isaiah Jones and Turvey sort of being two guys that are among that group. Probably not guys you would have predicted as this roster was kind of constructed in March, as being guys that maybe thought Toomer or like Magnum Farrar would have had larger roles than them.
Offensively, I mean, Indiana ran the ball really well, and that was both the way they were blocking, the way the scheme was kind of balancing different ideas. The fact that they got 3-4 guys involved, Kalen Black a little less involved. Curt Cignetti said he just kind of felt his hamstring tighten, so they just didn't test it, didn't push it. But I mean, again, that was one of these positions we talked about offensively that Indiana really remade in the offseason. Elijah Green had the 51-yard run late in the game, but he finishes with 5 carries for 82 yards. Tyson Lawton and Justice Ellison combined for 26 carries for 143 yards, and Lawton had 2 touchdowns. Everybody averaged at least 4.6 yards per carry. Like, it was that was about as good of a day running the football as Indiana's had in a long time, possibly pre-COVID. And that's against anybody. We're not just talking about, oh, well, they're only playing Florida International. Like, better than they ran the ball against Idaho, better than they ran the ball, against Indiana State, whoever. I think you can be encouraged by that. And then I think if you're Curt Cignetti, maybe your next question is why the run game didn't seem to open up more of the pass. Because, generally that's kind of the way that's supposed to work.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It was the most rushing yards since the Michigan State game in 2022. Um, the 39-31 game. But yeah, I mean, I think the passing game's still coming along. I mean, especially in terms of trying to get, they took some shots um, more in the second half, sort of 20 yards plus downfield. The only one really completion sort of through the air like that was that broken play that Rourke extended with his legs to the outside. So you kind of are waiting for that to come together. But I mean, that was probably something that was going to take time. Windig looked like he struggled with pass protection on that side. I think he allowed the most sort of quarterback pressures. And Rourke was moving around a lot. Didn't have tons of time to sort of settle in back there and kind of look down the field. So things that I think this week will probably give you a chance to work on.
Cignetti actually, I mean, he balanced out kind of I don't know if you call it the blame, because I mean, Indiana wasn't bad throwing the football. They were just never kind of, like elite throwing the football. They were never just, just unreal. Cignetti kind of balanced it out. He mentioned that I think he said he thought Carter Smith played well. You mentioned Trey Wedig, obviously, and maybe the sense that the pressure was coming a little bit too consistently off that right side. I thought Rourke had some good moments. Cignetti said he thought Rourke missed a couple deep shots, and that contributed to maybe the passing game not really opening up the way that Indiana wanted. Obviously, also Indiana loses Donovan McCulley to injury. Cignetti said kind of characterized him this week as day to day. Wouldn't kind of get into specifics of what his actual injury is. McCulley had I guess if anybody didn't see it, he was being tackled, and basically as he was being pulled to the ground, somebody kind of came, and it wasn't like targeting, but it was almost like somebody, maybe it was more of like a neck injury or sort of some sort of neck muscle injury, because somebody came kind of as he was being pulled down and kind of bent his head at an odd angle. So I don't know if we'll see McCulley this weekend. This is, Friday night against Western Illinois is the kind of game where you're going to rest players like that. Even, you probably wouldn't ask too much of a player like Donovan McCulley in a game like that anyway. You're certainly not going to risk aggravating an injury and making it more serious. But it was interesting to me too that Cignetti said basically, that he felt Curtis Rourke missed some shots. He felt that the line missed some protections. I think the thing he said was that, in a lot of those cases, it was nothing that he felt Indiana couldn't clean up pretty easily. And I think the other thing to say too is, if there's a place where Indiana's probably going to stay pretty vanilla in a game like this, especially with the way the game plays out, Indiana scores 3 straight touchdowns, go up 21-0. FIU answers with one, kind of quickly, or not I say quickly, but answers with one, sort of methodical drive, very into the first half to kind of get back into the game, and then really Indiana just kind of kills it as a contest, makes a field goal there in the second half, and then just kind of plays the game out, not necessarily impressively, but certainly without a lot of stress. If there's an area of the game or the scheme or the game plan, I guess, for lack of a better term, where you may see a team most guilty of keeping things simple, keeping things really vanilla, not wanting to put stuff on film, it's probably that pass game. Because number one, that's probably the thing that like really differentiated James Madison the most, in Cignetti's last 3 years. And so you're going to want to keep as much of that sort of proprietary until you need it against better opponents. Number two, you aren't pass blocking terribly well, and so you're probably not going to go to as much of a pass-based offense. And obviously you want to work on some things and you want to get things cleaned up, but you're not going to go crazy with it in week one. And number three, and I think this is important as well, you're running the ball pretty effectively. Indiana was running the ball, pretty consistently by the end of the game. Indiana had, trying to find the advanced numbers. Indiana had 12 what are called explosive plays, which are gains of either 10 plus rushing yards or 15 plus passing yards. The idea being obviously it's a little easier to gain yardage through the air. Indiana had 12 of those plays to Indiana's one, or to FIU's one. I've been vamping for a while because Mike's internet gave out, and so we're trying to get him back in. But Indiana had 12 of those
Did you
explosive
talk that
plays.
entire time?
Yeah, I did. It wasn't pretty, but I did. It was the Indiana 31, Florida International 7 of podcast vamping. But Indiana had 9 of Indiana's 12 explosive plays, 9 were on the ground. So the other thing is, while there are clearly things to clean up in the past game, and Mike, I'll bring you in here. I've just been talking about all the different reasons why, including some I possibly made up. Aliens landing on the 20-yard line, that sort of thing. Why Indiana might not have felt too urgent or too stressed about some of the struggles in the past game. The other piece of it is very basically, it's an area where you can stay vanilla, where you don't have to take many risks, because Indiana's running the ball effectively and explosively. 12 explosive plays. Of those 12, 9 were rushing yards, 154 rushing yards gained on those 9 plays specifically. I think there were a lot of reasons why it felt like Indiana never really got out of second gear in the past game, but Curt Cignetti seemed pretty confident. None of those were long-term concerns in his mind.
Yeah, and I think that explosiveness in the run game was actually encouraging. This was a team that did not. I mean, they had only 47 runs last year of 10 yards or more. Nothing. They were only team in the country that didn't have, I think, a run of more than 30 yards. And so, to see, because he talked about the improved athleticism, and you saw, I think, everybody that, except Black, obviously, who I think had a 7 or 8 yard gain, Elijah Green, Lawton, and Ellison had 10-yard or more carries, 10 yards or more gains. And Green obviously had the big one. So I think that's encouraging, to be honest. And so, you lean on those guys, you get through the game. You don't have to show much, because I view it, and not to discount FIU, for different reasons than last year. Even though last year were kind of similar, that this is your preseason until you get to UCLA. You're sort of, working through everything, and your first real sort of, the results count, but that it doesn't have to be pretty, it doesn't have to look good at times. You're trying to figure out where are the gaps, what do you need to improve to sort of be ready for that trip to LA. Because that's the one, out of this, we've heard Charlotte's not very healthy from their coach in press conferences. Out of this first 4 weeks, that's really the one you have to have and sort of have your full arsenal and sort of full playbook available.
And I also think, and this was one of my many points that I just kind of was spinning out while you were resetting your router. I also think too, I think the staff may also feel like the pass game is the area that needs to worry about least in terms of its own scheme and its own capability. In terms of that is, you look at Curt Cignetti's offenses pretty consistently. Historically, they have passed the ball well. I don't want to say they're pass first, but they are, often very sort of passing game reliant, sometimes pass based. And so that's an area where you're probably going to keep things most vanilla, just in terms of not wanting to put stuff on film. Obviously, you have the luxury of doing that if you're going to run the ball that well and control the game the way Indiana did while it was really in the balance. But that's also maybe the area where I think Indiana might be most wary of, giving away trade secrets before a game counts. I mean, like, if anything, I think Indiana's going to be more vanilla this weekend, this Friday night against Western Illinois. Because
I could see him going just to first rug, drop your own plays in the huddle.
Yeah.
Tell the one guy to go.
Just verts over
Holly
and
is
over.
available. This is a game where you just kind of go run as far as you can, and I'll just throw it towards you.
Well, see, I brought that up too while you were. I read the Gettysburg Address while you were logging back in. I guess I would be kind of surprised to see McCullough.
Yeah, he's not going to play. Yeah, no,
yeah. I mean, and Curt Cignetti said like day to day, he didn't seem overly concerned about it, although he wouldn't, sort of put a label on the injury. But in the same breath, like, this is I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if there's some dudes that are, for all intents and purposes, healthy and don't play in this game or don't play, like I wouldn't be shocked.
I think they'll give it. I think it'll be like a preseason where you get the first half.
Yeah, right. Like I think
Yeah,
there'll be some guys that will only play a quarter or two and will wonder, like, where did Aiden Fisher go? And the answer will basically be Indiana just didn't need to play them. And I think, listen, this is also the other chance. This is something Tom Allen always talked about, and to be fair, for better or worse, his teams wound up meeting it, more often than not. These are also games where you can go get that second team snaps, and you can, you can give Taven Jackson meaningful game reps, and not necessarily meaningful in terms of the score. By the time Taven Jackson's in the game, Indiana should be, up 4 or 5 scores, but more the idea that if you give Taven Jackson an entire half, or if you give Taven Jackson like 3 or 4 drives and then give Tyler Cherry 1 or 2 drives, then at very least, if those guys ever have to run back out there again, well, in a more live situation, they're not necessarily going to be overwhelmed by it. And so I think that's,
well, I think to your point, the offensive line really needs to get maybe a quarter at least, or quarter and a half. The freshman, I can never pronounce the local kid's name. The Indiana.
I think his last name is Ajanai. I think it's Ademola Ajanai, I believe.
Blah, 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 I don't know how you pronounced it there because it was just a bunch of vowels. But him, Leaford, I think, is the other one that's been playing on the interior, and he noted that they're not very deep.
I mean, he said like 6 basically, and I think
and Tyler Stevens has played a lot of football. He doesn't really. I mean, if he's playing center, I guess you probably want to give him some more snaps there. But I could see them trying to make a concentrated effort to get those guys.
Austin Barrett would be another one that I would think that would want some. Yeah, just, I mean, again, maybe not even necessarily guys you're gonna, in an ideal world from Indiana's perspective, see a lot of as the season goes on, but guys that
see that you're gonna need, because if there's another injury.
Yeah, like you want a player to at least just be able to have some time on task on the field on a live game if you're going to ask them to jump in for a half at Northwestern, or if they've got to, if they got to play 3 weeks in a row in October or something. I mean, that is, like, in a lot of ways, I think that's what this weekend needs to be for Indiana, even more so than last weekend. And like, I recognize that nobody ever wants to take an opponent too lightly, and you don't want to wind up in a game when you shouldn't be. But I mean, like, Western Illinois is, I mean, we'll talk about it a little bit here now, I guess, to wrap up. But like, Western Illinois, with all due respect, is just not a very good football team. Like, this should be the sort of game where Indiana can name its score in so much as it wants to. And
did you see, I think Bill Conley does the rankings, and there was 100% probability Indiana would win.
I didn't see that, but it doesn't surprise me. Like, I mean, I think you said they finished last in the country last year in FCS, and what, both yards per game and yards per game allowed. Was that right?
I believe. I mean, at least the yards per game. I mean, it's at the bottom. I will check real quick. Do you want to do some more vamping?
I'm so vamped out. The point is, I mean, it's not just an FCS team. It's an FCS team that just, I mean, we talked about their game against Northern Illinois at the top. Like, that's a MAC program, and obviously it's been a successful MAC program at times. It's not necessarily been the most successful MAC program in recent years, though. I think it's had some. It just hasn't quite been maybe what it was in that sort of Jerry Kill, Rod Carey, kind of period. But in terms of being like a consistent 10-11 win team, but still, I mean, Indiana, this is a game Indiana needs to be winning, and winning well. And more than that, a game where Indiana needs to kind of do any last experimenting. Because I think the other thing is, win or lose against UCLA, and it's probably notable that UCLA struggled a little bit with Hawaii last weekend. They went out to Hawaii and they didn't play great. I think they won by 3. I don't know if you can treat Charlotte the same way that you treat FIU in Western Illinois, in the sense that, like, it's almost kind of like once you get the car up into 3rd or 4th gear, like, it kind of needs to stay there a little bit, if you know what I mean. And obviously, anytime that you might, play a team, let's live in a world where Indiana beats Western Illinois and then manages to win the UCLA game and then is up something like 35-0 in the 3rd quarter on Charlotte. Like, anytime you get in a situation like that, no matter who you're playing, obviously you start having conversations about how much longer, Indiana, a starter needs to be in, or do you want to give a backup more snaps or whatever. But I do think there's an extent to which Charlotte can't quite be treated as a preseason game in quite the same way these two can, because you're going to have to gear up for UCLA. And then I don't know that you can necessarily gear back down in all the same ways, if that makes sense. So I think that's the other thing that makes this game, the experimenting, the trial and error, that makes this game a little bit more important from that perspective.
Sure, but one topic I did want to address since you wrote
I like how you definitely agreed with what I just said. Sure.
Definitely.
But anyway, moving on.
No, but to your point about just these games, since all three of the ones we're talking about are at home, and I think one of the topics that's been sort of on the mind of the coach, and I think fans were talking about it, were his comments. You know, and I don't know, you don't have to sort of state your column, but I'm, you know, curious if you want to kind of share what you said today about, you know, fans. I mean, because look, the atmosphere was not good after that first half at the stadium, and as we sort of get into the season, you know, will wins sort of cure that and sort of fix the problem, or do you think this is going to be sort of a persistent issue for Indiana? Obviously, since you've been on the beat a little longer than I have here.
Yeah, I mean, it's like this is really hard. Like it's very much like a chicken has to come before the egg thing. Like it is. I have been there for enough of these now that I understand anyone who says I just need to see the team win some of these games. I'll buy in as soon as they win some of them. One of the curiosities, and maybe one of the ultimate sort of, from Tom Allen's perspective, sort of unfortunate circumstances of his tenure, was that like very few of his big wins played out at home in front of fans. Their most important wins in that 19 season came on the road, most of them. And then obviously in 2020, they didn't have any fans in the stands until the bowl game. So you didn't engender maybe that sense of like, just you stick with us, we'll stick with you. Everybody's in it together. Look at what this environment does. Oh my God, look what Indiana did. But like, go talk to any former player. They will tell you it is incredibly dispiriting when they're, you know, locked in a one-score game with Michigan State or whoever in, you know, it doesn't matter what time it kicked off, whether it's a noon kickoff, 7:30 kickoff, doesn't matter. And they look up in the stands and 15,000 people have left. And listen, you know, on the one hand, it's the first day of the year, or first game of the year. It got a little hot in the afternoon. Indiana was winning 21-7, although I'd point out that wasn't exactly like a commanding lead at that point. And FIU got the ball after halftime. The issue that I have is just like, from a neutral's point of view, atmospheres affect results. They just do. And when you say you want Indiana to start winning some of these close games, you know, then someone says, then you need to stick around and cheer, because if Indiana's got 48,000 people screaming their heads off, they're a lot more likely to be able to capitalize on some sort of mistake that the opponent makes, and suddenly there's momentum and there's excitement and there's energy and everything that comes with that. And then what someone says in return is, well, but how many times have I had the football pulled out from under me? I understand that. But my point, and I think what was good about Cignetti saying it when he said it, is it's here at the beginning before, you know, any momentum has been expended, any goodwill has been lost. And he didn't belabor it. Like, he went out of the way to say it. No one prompted it. He said it in his opening statement. But in the same breath, when somebody kind of tried to pull him back on it, a couple questions in, he said, no, I've said my piece, and that's fine.
It was the first question. And my point is I was asking more about, you know, the chicken or the egg. I was asking, what are his expectations? Like, does he expect, like in October, it to be better if they're winning, or does he think it's more of a longer term? He needs to build even more equity than that. And he said what he's going to say, but I didn't just ask him sort of like, you just expand on it more. But I wanted what his expectations are, sort of. Does he worry that this is going to be a problem that does persist? And they have 8 home games this year, so this is like a big year in terms of like, it could help them sort of in that Big Ten schedule to have this.
And it's like, it's also difficult because the other thing is everybody always has an excuse. It was too hot. My kids wanted to leave. The game started too early. The game started too late. I wasn't interested in the opponent. It's a Friday night. Why did they schedule it on a Friday night? Even though obviously Indiana doesn't schedule games for Friday nights, but it's just sort of like it's kind of one of those things where I don't have like a passionate opinion on it either way. It's more just an observation that and I've written it before, and I got a lot of the same feedback, which is a lot of people saying, yeah, I agree, that's great. But then also a lot of people saying, okay, but this is my experience, my lived
For the
experience.
yeah, the recent bigger crowds with Cincinnati, Ohio State, Michigan, is it filling up with just the road fans, or were those home fans coming out for those games?
Cincinnati was home fans. That was a big time home sellout, and obviously that was the excitement around.
Was that the last time they believed then, essentially?
I think possibly, yeah. I mean, in a really meaningful way. And there have been times when, if memory serves, like they hung around for the Illinois game in the opener a couple years ago because it wasn't a great game, but it was a close game, and it was the opener. It was a Big Ten game, whatever. But it is just this sense that it kind of, you know, I mean, what I wrote and what I said is you can't clamor for culture change and success and then just sort of expect it to be someone else's job. Like there does just have to be a little bit of sort of buying in and taking that risk. Um, and I mean, like I said, I understand anybody who says, okay, but every time I've done that, it hasn't worked out. And I can't guarantee you it's going to work out this time. What I can guarantee you is if, as you said, Indiana's got, 45, 46, 48,000 for each one of these 7 remaining home games, it's probably going to, I mean, I would say it's probably going to go to a bowl game, barring some injuries. And I think the department also, listen, I think the department would also be well within its rights to say, we have brought all these new concessions in, we've expanded alcohol sales, we've expanded, like local vendors so that there's better food selection. I know that they've done stuff like enhanced wireless internet. They changed the student section to try and create more atmosphere there. Obviously, hiring Curt Cignetti, all the NIL fundraising, all these different things. The department is basically saying, what else can we give you? You keep asking for, well, the game day experience isn't good enough. What else can the department reasonably do? We're running out of time, but I would say for people, indystar.com/sports, if you want to read that, it's frankly probably more of a column than anything else. But I think it is, I think Cignetti's frustration was justified on Saturday, especially when you walk out in the second half and the crowd is probably 35-40% of what it was strength wise at kickoff. Anyway, we'll leave that there for now. Western Illinois at Indiana on Friday night. He will be there. He's Mike Niziolek. I'll be there. I'm Zach Osterman for the Bloomington Herald Times, for the Indianapolis Star. This has been Mind Your Banners. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you soon.